President Trump has reportedly had a lengthy phone call with Vladimir Putin, where they discussed Ukraine peace deal, a ceasefire, and even mutual visits. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to talk about that, plus the UK absolutely losing its mind over this, and of course, some questionable financial decisions by Russia and even by Congress. Let's get into it. Okay. So this is the story, right? Trump reportedly, not reportedly, by his own account, had a lengthy phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday and directed members of his national security team to immediately begin negotiations aimed at Russia's war with Ukraine. Now, this is sort of interesting because, again, the U.S. not a belligerent in this war. It is a supporter of Ukraine, certainly the key supporter of Ukraine, but ultimately the people who need to end this war are Ukrainians and Russians, right? So this is, of course, the first time that the two parties have spoken since Trump returned to the White House for a second term. And what I thought was interesting is, again, Trump said, quote, "I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin," right? He continued, "We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects," right? Trump said he and Putin talked about, quote, "the great benefit that we will someday have in working together," and agreed on the need to end Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, this is, I think, there's a couple of different sort of lenses by which we can interpret this, right? Right. Trump also said later in the day that his phone call with Putin lasted about an hour. The two leaders would likely meet in Saudi Arabia for the first sit-down of his new term. He said that Putin, quote, "wants peace," and, quote, "wants to see it end," both of which are obviously true, right? And that Zelensky wrote that, quote, now, Zelensky wrote on X, he said, quote, "No one wants to see peace more than Ukraine," and that, quote, "Ukraine is charting our next steps to stop Russian aggression and ensure a lasting, reliable peace," right? Now, this is one of those things that can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways. I like to think that the generous interpretation is that this is about realpolitik, right? And at the end of the day, there is some stuff, right, where there just needs to be a recognition that Trump says, listen, Putin, he's not a democratically elected leader. He's a dictator, but he is the dictator who's been in Russia for 25 years. And it's silly of us to try to negotiate, to say, oh, well, we don't even recognize your election wins. We want to pretend you don't exist. And there's a real argument for that, right? There's a real argument for realpolitik. Now, the problem is when you end up with, well, as the British are pointing out, that they feel like this has been a selling out of Ukraine. Why do they feel that way? Well, they feel that way mostly because of what Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said in recent comments just a few days ago in Brussels, where, or in the Ukraine Working Group. And Hegseth said, essentially, as we talked about on this channel, that Ukraine is never going to get back all of its pre-2014 territory, and that Ukraine's never going to be a NATO member. Now, here's the problem. NATO has said explicitly that Ukraine is on a path to become a NATO member. They've said, actually, that Ukraine NATO membership is inevitable, right? And here's the problem is that the alliance is only as strong as it is credible, right? And so the problem is when NATO says something, they can't be totally derailed. And that's one of the reasons that the administration, right, the U.S. has actually been one of the forces blocking Ukraine's NATO membership, because the U.S. realizes that, again, it has to walk this thread between the NATO open door policy, which has existed since the alliance was created, that said, listen, anyone can apply to be a member of NATO. No one gets the door closed to them. And that is a reflection of the fact that, well, it's a reflection of the entire Western sort of mentality that says, listen, any country that shares our democratic ideals is welcome to join this alliance, right? In the early 2000s, people actually considered Russia as a potential future NATO member. And so saying that, listen, anyone that wants to can, Ukraine raised their hand and said, we would like to. And NATO said, yeah, as long as you keep on the path, you are welcome to join. And so the fact is that Russia says, but nobody asked me Nobody asked me, Russia, if this deal between Ukraine and NATO is allowed to go through. And NATO points out, they say, well, Russia, you don't own Ukraine. They're their own country with their own government that can do whatever they want. And Russia goes, they can't do whatever they want. They have to be in the Russian sphere of orbit. And, that sort of sparked, some people argue, again, even Putin debate doesn't believe this is true, but right, the thinking was that this was part of the drivers for Putin to annex Crimea and annex the Donbas, right, in 2014. And that as long as Ukraine didn't control its own territory, it was really going to be stalled out in terms of NATO membership. And this has sort of been the status quo for a long time, right? Where Ukraine isn't really moving towards NATO membership, but it's not off the track either. And this is sort of what makes the whole Putin was surrounded by NATO argument kind of nonsense, because for 10 years, there was a stable status quo where NATO was happy to not answer the ultimate question of how long before Ukraine gets here. Ukraine was happy to simply be on the path to NATO membership, especially given that it provided a lot of security assistance while they fought the separatists. And then, once again, the only person who had a problem with this was Vladimir Putin, who was like, no, I need to own all of Ukraine. That's because I have the vision of a restored Russian empire. And won't someone think of my restored Russian empire? Doesn't the restored Russian empire get a say in this? So this entire scheme, the reason this whole thing is going on is because to NATO members, it looks like NATO is weak when Pete Hegseth says Ukraine will never be a NATO member. It looks like NATO could be easily bullied out. A regional war, right, perpetrated by one country with a economy and a fraction of the size of Europe's or the EU's, has bullied NATO away from their position. And so every NATO member is going to look and they're going to say, listen, all it takes to get NATO to pack up and go home is literally one country in a regional war against a non-NATO member. That's all it takes, and they'll fold. By the way, guys, worth pointing out, NATO appears to have folded, based on Pete Hegseth's statements, after taking 0 casualties, right? You might recall the Chinese strategy to fight the U.S., that the U.S. will be unwilling to sustain even a few hundred casualties or a few thousand casualties early in the war, and they'll quickly go home. And in fact, the Chinese now probably are saying, wow, the NATO alliance is so weak that even if they don't take a single casualty, they will still back off. And so that's why the British are pretty mad about this. They've said, it may not be selling out. This is partially selling out Ukraine, and it's partially a bad negotiating tactic to say, listen, here's these things that are off the table. They're off the table publicly. And again, you have to think about negotiating. Where are they both starting? Well, now Ukraine was starting with full territorial restoration, and Russia was starting with a complete abandonment of the Kiev government. The whole Kiev government has to go. Well, now look what's happened. Now Kiev is starting here, and Russia hasn't softened its stance at all. There's nothing that Russia has said that has indicated a softened stance. In fact, if you add in Keith Kellogg saying, hey, you have to hold elections, in a way, that also is a little bit of a gift to Putin. Because the Ukrainians are like, no, dude, we can't hold elections while 20% of our citizens are under Russian occupation. That doesn't make any sense. And so this sort of, you see how the only person giving things up in this war appears to be Ukraine. And now Trump says, we're going to start negotiations. Well, where's the middle now? Where's the middle they're going to meet in? The literal middle for them to meet in is basically a Russian victory. Russia, somebody put it in the comments. What has Russia given up as a show of good faith in this negotiation? What Russian ambition has so far been, has Putin said, it's off the table? We wanted to see X, it's off the table, right? Nothing as far as I can tell. And that, I think, is the gripe that the British have. Now, let's pivot for a sec. Here's why this is classic, I think, Trumpian whiplash, right? He's saying stuff. It may be true. It may not be true. He continues to be treated by the Europeans like a European politician. He's not. He says a lot of shit because literally hours later, Trump says, oh, without U.S. aid, Putin would say he won. And Trump also says, aid secured, baby. We got a deal with Kiev, $500 billion mineral deal. And the U.S. president said Kiev, quote, essentially agreed to provide $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals in exchange for continuing U.S. support. And that's a pretty good deal for Kiev. In fact, this is probably the wink, wink, nod, nod deal that was probably already on the table. Because obviously, who is going to be able to deploy the capital to extract this level of mining operation from Ukraine once peace is made? Is it going to be the Ukrainians themselves? Not really. They're probably not going to have the capital to get this a $500 billion mining operation. The Europeans, maybe. But you know who's not going to get this? It's the Russians. And so for Kiev, right, for the U.S., it may have been already kind of an understanding that, listen, we bring sort of Ukraine into this Western economic orbit, and in exchange, you get a huge investment in your mining sector. We get access to rare earth minerals that, again, in the event of a conflict, we can sit there and go to Ukraine and go, hey, guys, I noticed that China's invaded Taiwan and they need these rare earth minerals. Right now, we are a U.S. company or a U.S.-Ukrainian joint partnership is doing the extraction. We need you to not sell to the Chinese. And they'll go, okay. Kiev will go, okay, you guys have been fair. You guys have dealt with us more than fairly all along. So I think Trump, again, is saying a deal out loud that was probably already the case. Again, but the problem is you can't sit there and be like, hey, we're going to give you, he's using the word give. I'm assuming he means sell, right? Or like some sort of exclusive sale of rare earth minerals. And you can't do both of these deals, right? And I think this is something that, again, it's whiplash because and maybe this is part of it. Maybe this is part of the negotiating strategy to sit there and make the Ukrainians go, damn, there could be some kind of sweetheart deal with Russia that Trump just struck, and to make Russia go, damn, the U.S. may have just struck a sweetheart deal with Ukraine. So we should both get the best deal we can. We should both sit down now. That has a New York real estate guy vibe. It really does. And I might be being generous, right? Putin's a very smart actor, a very, very smart actor. You don't become the sole dictator of an entire country like Russia by not being able to do some serious cutthroat deals. So it remains to be seen how this plays out. But again, I think ultimately we've got to talk about the European defense establishment. We do, because you have to put this in context. And before we talk about that, I wanted to mention that it's Thursday, which means two things are dropping. First, on Combat Vet News, another video of uncensored combat footage coming straight from the front lines, right? This is some of the uncensored videos. YouTube won't let me post them. Plus, you may notice that I'm pretty critical of everybody on this channel, and the reason is because I don't take money from governments. I don't take money from major media conglomerates. And trust me, both of them have shown up in my inbox. But I have you guys backing me up, supporting me. And so do that over on Combat Vet News. Become a member, right? Every Tuesday and Thursday, uncensored combat videos. And, oh, by the way, every Thursday, a Q&A for the lieutenant and colonel tier members. So if you have questions, you could submit them. I'll answer them. And they're everything from questions about my trip to Ukraine, questions about what I think is going to happen in the future, questions about even my personal training and all the other stuff. So the link is in the description. Become a member today. Okay. Now, join me in being mad. One, Reddit. Reddit has never been good, but now it's especially just like very polemic, right? It's saying Putin-Trump pact. Guys, I don't think that's the case. Again, it could be, but there has to be evidence for it first. More evidence than Putin and Trump had a chat, okay? So let's start there. Next, the Europeans, France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, UK, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, says, "We are ready to enhance our support for Ukraine. We commit to its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's war of aggression." This is understandable because, again, the United States of America is unlikely to lose territory in a war of aggression from Russia. Poland, not so much. Germany, not so much. There is a realistic possibility that if Putin gets a nice peace deal, that he may believe, especially if he believes he's already scared off NATO, he may believe that he can annex other countries. Probably not NATO countries. That's pretty unlikely. But countries that are potential allies that are not NATO members, like Moldova, for example, Putin may be willing to roll into Moldova. In fact, in some ways, he may feel he has to roll in to Moldova because his economy has become so militarized, right? Now, they obviously share the same thing. This is a carefully worded statement. The Europeans share the same goal to keep supporting Ukraine until a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace is reached. Peace that guarantees the interests of Ukraine and our own. We're looking forward to discussing the way ahead with our American allies, which is code for I can't fucking wait to hear this. I can't fucking wait to hear what the Americans have to say about this. Our shared objective should be to put Ukraine in a position of strength. Ukraine and Europe must be part of any negotiations. Ukraine should be provided with strong security guarantees, and a just and lasting peace in Ukraine is a necessary condition for a strong transatlantic security. Recall that security of the European continent is our common responsibility. Therefore, we are working together to strengthen our collective defense capabilities. Here's what annoys me. Is that the EU, right? Here is a chart depicting the EU's GDP against the United States. And what I want to point out is that this difference, right, this is total GDP as a percentage of their GDP in the year 2000. So since the year 2000, the U.S. has grown its entire economy by 50%. Europeans grown by just 35%, right? Even less if you consider the entire euro area outside the EU, but we're not going to, right? But this may this may be a closer proxy for NATO. But I'd like to use the EU because that has already a transnational sort of block. And since then, the EU has had basically flat growth in the post-COVID era, whereas the US has rocketed back in the post-COVID era, growing something like 2 to 3% more. And so you're looking at probably about 160 to about 130. So they are roughly equivalent, not quite. The Europeans aren't quite there, but they're pretty close. But I want to point out the defense spending. The United States spending $916 billion with a B on defense in 2023, right? Next up, China, of course, with an asterisk because the Chinese sort of hide their defense budget in all kinds of other places that we don't expect. Russia, also prone to sort of playing games. But you can see that in terms of defense spending, you have India, the Saudis, and then coming in at less than 10% of the US, you have the UK, Germany at about 0.6% of the US, right? Ukraine, who of course can spend this because they're being subsidized in part by the US, France, Italy, Poland, and then Israel. So why do I point these things out? Because these European countries simply do not and have not, in 3 years of having a major threat on the European continent, they appear to have not responded in any kind of meaningful way. The Europeans are not willing to spend. They've increased their defense spending a little bit. I'll give them credit where credit's due, right? But let's see if we can find EU defense spending per as a percent of GDP. Now, bear in mind, guys, right? Let's see if we can find this. Here we go. European defense spending, about a third of the United States. Again, bear in mind, they have an economy that's something like 80 to 85% of the size of the United States, but they're spending only 30% of the US's budget, right? And they are beyond. Now, the NATO has a 2% target, and they're, quote, closing the gap to the 2% target. But many European countries, of course, have budget crunches because their countries' economies are growing very, very slow, Now, the average country spending 2.2% on GDP. Bear in mind, Estonia and Latvia doing their part, 5% of GDP. Poland planned to reach 4.7% in 2025. But the largest European countries, the largest European economies still are very low. The US, for context, spends about 3%, maybe 3.5% of its GDP on defense spending. And during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that number was about 4%. So the US is really very, we are considered this defense crazed country when in fact we're spending about 50% more than the Europeans. But again, put in context, there is no reason the Europeans, with a clear, imminent, pressing threat. And by the way, here's one other thing to point out. The United States, we have obligations that the Europeans simply do not. Right? The Europeans have 0 nuclear weapons. Why? Because they have the United States. We maintain and safeguard a nuclear arsenal. That is part of our role in the NATO alliance. Right? The UK also does, France also does, but on a much more limited basis. So that means countries like Germany, they do not have to worry about maintaining a nuclear fleet. They don't have to worry about maintaining a navy. The US, of course, has to maintain a navy with a global presence. And so all of these things mean that this Germany should be a ground military powerhouse, but they're not, right? And this is the thing. The Europeans are masters at complaining about why someone else isn't stepping up when they have had 3 years to wake up to the reality that despite whatever fucking dumb shit they tell themselves within their own government, the rest of the world, the rest of the globe is still a dog-eat-dog world. And if you don't want to be a small dog that gets chewed up, you have to grow some teeth. You have to grow some fangs. And seeing the EU continually operate with this mentality that they're mad that the US isn't backing up them. Fine, I'm mad too. I think the U.S. should play hardball with Putin, and they're not. But the EU, if you want to see at the table, you have to do more, period. Now, a lot of people say, oh, is Trump's statements about these peace talks good for Russia? Well, the Russian economy says it sure is. You can see almost every one of these sanctioned Russian companies going green just on the hope that the Russian economy may get access back to the global economic order, right? Now, here's 2 things I want to point out. One, Europeans are not, it's not just defense spending, it's European soft power, where the EU says, listen, again, we have an economy the size of the United States, roughly 80% of the size, but actually we can't do we can't backfill any of USAID's cut funding. Again, if soft power, bear in mind, this is something that the Europeans should have no moral qualms about filling, right? They somehow say, well, we are not automatically filling the void with European money because we don't have the money, which is, again, just sort of really aggravating when the Europeans simply, I've never seen an economy this size experience such incredible lack of agency, an incredible sense of learned helplessness, where they go, oh, right? Like you're Europeans. If soft power, if democratic loyalty was so important, why does only the U.S. write these checks? And again, I'm not saying that some of what the USAID does, I think is preposterous. I think it's a total waste of taxpayer money when you're a country who funds itself through 50% of your budget every year is debt, right? Imagine swiping the credit card to donate to charity, right? If you did that, you'd say, listen, we'd want it to pay dividends. We want it to be clearly serving U.S. objectives. And it's not clear that USAID does that. And again, I've talked about the fact that that the Constitution does not allow the executive to simply choose not to spend things. Congress allocates money. Congress created USAID. Only Congress can defund USAID. But all that said, again, the Europeans are just like a huge dog that simply still thinks it's a puppy. still thinks it's a no, please don't let Russia hurt us. Guys, Russia's the equivalent of a 6-pound chihuahua. It's barking. But you're Europe. You have 200 million people. You have an economy that's 17 times the size of Russia's. Fight them. Fight them, you idiots. So, again, Europe, a museum disguised as a country. And it doesn't mean that things are going great for Russia. That's the other thing. Russia burning through its gold reserves, right? Obviously, because of the country's record high interest rate imposed by the central bank to help cool the economy. But Russia, again, we've talked about this, that it seems that someone, likely Putin, is telling the central bank, dude, you can't raise interest rates. It's already too expensive for major companies to get loans. As a result, the only way to sort of stabilize the ruble is, again, to sell foreign currency reserves and defend the ruble, which they've been doing, selling off their gold tremendously. And as we've talked about, the math is pretty clear. 2025, probably not going to be a great year for Russia. In fact, in some ways, Russia's ability to produce more armored vehicles and produce more military hardware, its ability to fight and defend its currency, its ability to create basically a stable economy, even in the context of this massive war, is going to be diminished. So the clock is ticking, which is why I think the Europeans may be sitting there and saying, the U.S., like, why are you now offering them a lifeline? Why are you now offering them a ceasefire when the screws are just now being put to them? And again, it's the Europeans just, they just act like they're not their own country. They're not, well, they're not, but they're not their own bloc. It's preposterous. But don't worry, guys. The U.S. is not out here being Mr. Common Sense, right? They're not out here. And I think it's worth pointing out that, as I've talked about on this channel, you can't, when you fund your government, 50% of your spending, your lifestyle, is funded on the credit card, you got to take a hard look about what you swipe. And don't worry, guys. Donald Trump is absolutely doing that. Just kidding. House Republicans, right, are happy to extend $4.5 trillion in tax cuts. That's 10% of the entire U.S. economy, not the entire government budget. Every single dollar produced by the United States, we're going to be cutting taxes by 10% and lift the debt ceiling. Guys, that is not what you do when your country is both badly in debt and you correctly identify, hey, we got to cut spending. It's like this. It's just like your own budget. There's some key differences between, a country's budget and a home budget. But in this instance, you do need to tamp down spending, right? And when that happens, there's two ways you do it. You make more money and you spend less money. That is how you close a hole in your budget, right? Now, we don't need to balance the budget. We just need to have the budget, the deficit, not outstrip our increased earnings, right? Every year, obviously, the gross domestic product of the United States goes up a little bit because we have a very dynamic, powerful economy. But it's a little bit. It's like 2%. And the budget deficit grows by 10, 15% every year. And correctly, the administration has said, we can't spend all this money. Now, again, they're doing it in ways that I don't think are constitutional, which is like a red alert, right? But they're sort of thinking about the right things, which is cutting U.S. spending where it's extraneous. But there's another part to the equation. You have to bring in more money. And this does not do that. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office, who is just the actuaries whose job it is to do the math. They're just accountants. They don't have a party policy, right? Congress knocks on their door. There says, listen, here's going to be what we're thinking in terms of taxes and spending. And the nerds at CBO spit it out. And the nerds at CBO have said, this is insane. This will not work, right? Now, obviously, this is not what the president was elected to do, right? People wanted to see him restore a level of balance to the budget. And when you see them just be like, no, we're actually just going to cut services, we're going to transfer that money to rich people, you're just like, come on, guys. Just try. Just pretend to try. Especially when CBO is like, dude, this is not going to help. This is going to make things worse. This is somehow going to make things worse. You've managed to somehow enact a bunch of cuts and you're still managing to make things worse. But don't worry, guys. I'm sure U.S. companies will have a great quarter. I'm sure those CEOs, their stocks are going to perform great for the next quarter, and they're going to get a huge payday. And then when they leave, right, I'm sure they will be able to afford private jets to countries with more stable currencies. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Enjoy this Debbie Downer video. Thanks to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergey Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M. I Just Guy Called. Join me on Combat Vet News. Become a member. And see the video drops today. See you in the next one, guys. Cheers.